Steve Bannon, and by the way, I encourage the President Bannon hashtag on Twitter. I think if there is any way to start making him less of the Trump whisperer, playing to Trump's insecurity is always the path.
Also, he's indefensible, so the more attention you can get on this guy and make them have to own him.
That's correct. That's correct. And so it's a story that like last week of like, oh, Paul Ryan's learning to like Steve Bannon. Again, it should show you who the fuck Paul Ryan is. Jesus Christ. Look, that was in the Scott Atran interview. Somehow the liberal professional class, which thought it was so savvy, got so, honestly, the only word could be wussified and complacent, that when they're dealing with people, it's one thing to go up against Bernie Sanders and say, like, oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Look at this crazy old guy. And then they're going up against first a Republican Party with even just Mitch McConnell and John Boehner, who's like, we will literally take the currency in the viability of credit of good standing in the United States to the absolute brink just to please some Glenn Beck listener in the Midwest and our campaign contributors who really think this country should just be a private subsidiary of whatever petro company they own. They couldn't even respond to that. And now it's proto-fascist. So if ever there was a time to grow the fuck up and get real and get cynical and get ruthless, it's now. But let me just read briefly about what happened at the National Security Council. So President Mr. Trump has given a shakeup to the National Security Council. And what he has done is first and foremost, he's granted Steve Bannon a seat at the council, which is significant. So David Axelrod, who was Obama's political advisor, sat in on some meetings, but he was not given a permanent seat. He also basically had the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Director of National Intelligence and two of the most senior defense chiefs will attend meetings only when, quote unquote, meetings are related to their responsibilities and expertise. Both Barack Obama and George W. Bush gave men in these roles regular seats on the council. This is, of course, in the same week that Bannon told the press to shut up. Now, this is at the bare minimum. And again, we need to make these kinds of distinctions now. It's one thing to oppose and have a critique of U.S. foreign policy, period, because of civilian casualties, because of weighing business over other concerns, because of propping Saudi Arabia, because of, any number of things to criticize, right? But if you can't see the distinction of still within that limited and flawed framework of saying to some degree, there is a part of this process that just says, okay, here are people that are professionals in this field and are going to give you some assessment of how and why something works independently of a political calculus. Now, we already saw the consequences of invading Iraq and how Bush Cheney lied about it, of politicizing intelligence to reach a political outcome when it was just bloodthirsty neocon delusions. But what about when it's a guy who said a couple years ago that there needs to be a restoration of the Christian faith militant? What about when it's a guy who presided over, in his own words, like a home of the alt-right and all sorts of neo-racist and neo-misogynist movements? And this is where I have to say the Russia piece people need to think about. I don't know about hacking the election. I don't know about all of that stuff. I think there's some smoke there and there's some fire there. Some of it might be exaggerated. Some of it might be totally
We
real.
await more evidence.
We await more evidence. But I wouldn't dismiss it either. I wouldn't be a dum-dum in either direction on that one. Then there's, again, some people have this fantasy that Russia is somehow some sort of misunderstood anti-hegemon, when in fact it is, niet. It is a miniature hegemon playing just as ruthlessly and just as cruelly as anyone for its sphere of influence. And part of how they have projected their sphere of influence is connecting with neo-fascist far-right parties in Hungary, backing on their satellite outlets and giving voice to Brexit, having analysts on who are connected with neo-Nazi parties. Now, they also have people on that I respect and I like and all the rest of it. But undoubtedly, a tool that is part of Russian foreign policy is to support neo-fascist and far-right movements, certainly in Europe. That's endlessly documented, also including, obviously, the National Front in France. If you don't think that a guy who comes with a neo-nationalist worldview, who talks about America's civic culture, and now is sitting on the board, sitting in major defense and national security meetings, if you don't think that that has an effect in terms of politicizing intelligence and endangering where America can go, let me just read briefly from this, and then we'll get from John McCain. This happened over the weekend. China military official says war with the U.S. Donald Trump is becoming a quote-unquote practical reality. This is from a report in The Independent in the UK. War with the U.S. under Donald Trump is not just a slogan and becoming a practical reality, a senior Chinese military official has said. These remarks were published in the People's Liberation Army website, apparently in response to aggressive rhetoric toward China from the new administration. They communicated the views from inside China Central Military Commission, which is overall authority of China's armed forces. Now, these are not people that don't know what Dan Dicker was saying a couple weeks on this show. There is an assessment in a place like China that says, if these people are going to be just as ruthless as us, maybe even more so, in global resource wars and petro conflicts, and they want to align with Russia and pivot against us, okay. We can project things too. And at this point, ignoring the racial dimension of this it's not just irresponsible, it's delusional. Now, here's someone who is actually, ironically, very irresponsible. John McCain has spent a lot of his career talking about country first and blah, blah, blah. Of course, Sarah Palin is another hidden link in the Steve Bannon career. Steve Bannon had made a documentary film about Sarah Palin. He was her horse. She was his horse for a little while before he found his soulmate in the man-child, small-handed, trust fund baby, orange-faced dictator. John McCain is concerned about Bannon's appointment to the NSC. And here he is in typical McCain fashion talking with John Dickerson on Face the Nation. I wonder if any action will come out of this concern.
President Trump, but that, he's saying, I've given the Secretary of Defense the power to overrule me. Do you see that more broadly as a positive sign for President Trump?
I think the national security team around President Trump is very impressive, and I think you couldn't ask for a better one, whether it be General Kelly, General Flynn is great, General Mattis, and the ones they are bringing on board on their team. I am worried about the National Security Council, who are the members of it and who are the permanent members. The appointment of Mr. Bannon is something which is a radical departure from any National Security Council in history. Remember Karl Rove, when he sat in on one, and Axelrod, when he was supposedly, look, and the role of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has been diminished, I understand, with this reorganization. One person who is indispensable would be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in my view. So it's of concern, this, quote, reorganization.
I wonder what John McCain will do about that concern. Probably the same amount of things he did about Rex Tillerson as Secretary of Defense, even though John McCain and Lindsey Graham are the biggest Russia fearmongers on the planet, which is, of course, to say nothing. Now, Karl Rove was a tremendous, disgusting, and is a tremendous, disgusting political hack. He helped manage PR for the Bush White House and was involved, obviously, in hyping the invasion of Iraq. But he was an addendum. He was a PR appendage to things that were already going to happen, whether it was global war on terrorism or the invasion of Iraq. David Axelrod, who I have a lot more sympathy for, a lot more respect for, and like a lot more than Karl Rove, it's a similar role. He's a PR strategist. He's a comms guy. And there's going to be a comms strategy around how Obama's doing drones, how Obama's positioning his reinvented war on global terrorism, okay? Steve Bannon is the chief strategist, clearly in all senses, for a guy who knows nothing. So it's not just an escalation of a political advisor sitting at the NSC. You have the traditional people demoted and a guy with a demented, global, bloodthirsty worldview elevated. It's a different thing.
Hey, it's Sam Seder. Why don't you subscribe to this channel? You can do so right over here. Subscribe.